Yeah, water, my favorite topic. It's fun to kind of come and especially talk about this whole farm water kind of management, which brings together so many of the little pieces that I work with farmers on. And it's kind of fun to kind of step back and think holistically about the whole farm, and how you address flows through it, and amounts of rainfall and drainage and irrigation and all that. And but it is challenging. I'll say that. To start, it's a lot to try to cram into 30 minutes. So I think I'll try to touch some high points, and then really looking forward to the conversation and hearing what's happening on your farms and or the farmers you're working with. All right. So just to frame things, and while we're talking about water, I use similar sides to this fairly often. In climate change, right? I mean, things are just kind of really becoming much more uncertain and erratic in the recent past. But if you look at the past 100 years, which is what I'm showing here, we see this fairly unconcerning, and this is for Vermont, unconcerning increase in annual average precipitation, or not so concerning. This is, under 7 inches over 100 years. That's multiple generations on the farm, probably many, lots of opportunities to adapt. However, you see quite a bit of variation in those 100 years. And when you start to slice this data a little differently, which is what I have done just recently for another presentation, I looked at the 20 years before I arrived in Vermont to take a job with UVM Extension focused on climate change. And you see a very different trend in terms of average annual precipitation, where, instead of 8 inches over a century, you start to see this trend on it tracking to be 63 inches over a century from 1992 to 2011. So if you were, if you started farming, or no, if even if you were farming before 1992 and you were farming in those 2 decades, it seems like you kind of thought the sky was falling. There was just so much rain. And I saw that, coming to Vermont and working with farmers in those first 5 years, it was all about too much water, too much water, too much water. That's what people were dealing with and trying to adapt to. And then when you stretch this trend out to current day, 2022, 2023, that trend was flattened dramatically. This is looking at a 30-year time period. So you kind of see this wild increase for 20 years, and then this pretty significant decrease, which leveled out that trend. And I think this says 2 things. One, it says that in the past 10 years, we've seen a lot more drought. We've seen much more of those dry years than we did in the preceding 20 years. And it also just speaks to how uncertain and erratic each year can be. And even within a year, we can see water extremes on either end. The wettest May followed by the driest July later on in the season. So just really kind of interesting data, and I think it kind of helps lay the groundwork for this conversation a little bit. Okay, so with that out of the way, I want to jump into this topic of whole farm water management. And just a few notes here. As I was putting this together, I realized we should probably almost have some disclaimers up front because of the enormity of this topic. And I'll just start with saying every farm is a unique combination of landscape, soil, climate, and management factors. And that's true for all extension topics, learning how to do this or that. That's absolutely true. But I think maybe this becomes much more clear when you look at the farm holistically and try to think about whole farm water management. That every farm is very different in terms of the geology, the topography, how the land is being used. It's just and it's very difficult to provide those one-size-fits-all solutions for whole farm water management. So it's kind of this challenging thing, but it's really fun to try to address it as best we can. And then the other thing I would say here is that any decisions around whole farm water management, I don't know, maybe we'll get into that after the presentation here. I don't know how long folks have been farming their land, but I would say because of what I just showed, partly because of what I just showed with the climate variability, precipitation variability, any decisions around whole farm water management should really be based on multiple years of observations, you know, so that you capture those wet years or wet strings of years and those dry years or you know, several dry years in a row. So you kind of have a true understanding of the boundary conditions that you're dealing with. And then also importantly, some of the approaches that I'll talk about this evening and that can be most effective should probably involve the assistance of a technical service provider. And I say that first because some of the things, you know, that we do to manage water on our farms involve a significant amount of cost, and if you're not feeling confident about it, it's good to make sure that your money's put to good use and go ahead and pay for someone who has experience or credentials in a certain area, you know, drainage and pond building, etc. And it's also good to have input on some of these things do have regulatory considerations. We know, you know, we can't, you know, if we have a wetland on the farm, we can't just go in and drain that wetland and start farming vegetables in there. There's some real concerns with that. So I think everyone knows this, but it's good to kind of involve someone with regulatory expertise and knowledge. Your local NRCS office is a great source for that. It does take some time because they have, you know, they're trying to serve lots of folks and do those wetland delineations on many farms. But I think it's, you know, the consequences for doing something you shouldn't do are steep. So it's good to just go ahead and check the boxes on that. All right. So in terms of kind of where we start with whole farm water management, my recommendation, and probably goes without saying, is that maybe we start with an assessment of the farm. And probably the two questions that we're going to be interested in are, where do I have too much water? Or where do I need more water? Pretty straightforward, no brainers there, right? So then it starts to get a little bit more exciting, because I think then the next question we have to ask ourselves and evaluate is, how is water moving through my farm? Based upon topography, based upon soils, based upon geology, based upon man-made modifications. What is the path it's taking through my farm when it falls from the sky, or whether it enters my farm from another, adjoining area? What is the path that it takes? And then how can I alter that flow path to meet those first two needs? So it's just kind of like, it's pretty simple, but I think it's helpful for me to kind of like, when I first visit a farm, kind of think through these with the farmer and assess, especially that flow path question. You know, how is water moving through this farm, and then what can we do about it? When we ask ourselves that, I think the key considerations are that influence the answers to these questions are topography, of course. And I mentioned these, topography, soil texture, that's a biggie for me. Like always, I'm very interested in understanding what the soil texture is in different fields on the farm, different hill slopes, et cetera, because that has such a large influence on water movement. Geology, of course, we know it does. Shallow bedrock, ledge, outcroppings, all these can influence water movement. Then what type of intervention do we want to do? I mentioned this, what are the regulations related to that? And then what is the cost related to that? Because some of these, like I mentioned, can have a significant cost. Okay, so water movement on the farm, and I show this for a couple reasons. This is, slicing a landscape, looking at a cross-sectional view of a landscape. just kind of trying to capture all the different inputs, outputs, transfers between one place and another on the farm, and then where is there storage on the farm. We can have surface storage, and we can have ground storage, subsurface storage, all these things. Just wanted to show kind of the complexity of what you need to consider when you think about whole farm water management. There are a lot of arrows. There are a lot of water flowing different ways across and through and into a farm. And the other reason I wanted to show this is, and this applies especially to those farming hill slopes, at least in eastern Vermont and eastern New York, anywhere we have glaciated landscapes. We have this kind of phenomena happening where a lot of our runoff on our farms actually doesn't run across the surface of the soil. It actually infiltrates into the soil and then flows through the subsurface, and it moves downhill through the subsurface. And that's what I'm in the middle of my screen. I don't know if you can see my arrow. I have the subsurface storm flow, and that becomes really important and is kind of counterintuitive to a lot of folks, myself included, until I truly understood the hydrology of these soils. Is that, you know, water will infiltrate in the upper regions of the hill slope, soak into the ground, and then flow very rapidly down in the shallow subsurface on top of a fragipan or a densik layer, and then reemerge somewhere in the hill slope below it. And that has implications for how we choose to manage that water, what intervention we might make, what drainage intervention we might make, or will a pond be suitable for that location, et cetera, et cetera. So just good to be aware of those things. Oh, and I included this slide. I forgot whether I'd taken this out last moment or not, but and so to kind of like go back to this idea of water soaking into the upper soils, that is, like I mentioned, somewhat counterintuitive. And really, runoff is generated one of two ways. And the first way is, I think, what most of us think about when we think about how runoff is generated. And that is here on the left, called infiltration excess. We don't need to know the term, but that's where it's raining too hard. It's raining hard enough that it just can't soak into the soil. And so you get what you see on the lower left corner of the screen, that kind of surface runoff, you know, always what we conventionally think of as how runoff is occurring. And then on the right side of the screen, we see that other mechanism occurring, which is called saturation excess runoff. And that's where water soaks into the soil because the soil is very permeable. And then it hits a restrictive layer and it completely saturates that profile, and then starts to actually reemerge from the soil upward and run off that way. And that's what I'm trying to show there in the bottom right-hand corner of the screen. So just two different processes. Good to be aware of which one is dominant on your farm. And I will say that this one on the right is actually was discovered in Danville, Vermont, in the late 1960s, 1970s, by a couple of folks, Dunn and Leopold, and kind of changed the world of hydrology and how we think about runoff is generated. And it's very commonplace in New England. Okay. So that's just a little bit more background. Now let's talk about that assessment of the farm. So the first thing I would recommend using is a soil survey. And some of you probably use these for your farm. There are printed ones that now everything is accessible online. There's a web soil survey from the USDA. Have the link there. Great resource. It is a little bit clunky, if I can say that. There's tremendous amount of information in there. It's just a little bit hard to use. The second link contains much of the same information. It's a more usable interface, and it doesn't have, but it also doesn't have quite the depth of information, I guess. But it has much of what you would probably need or want for a whole farm water assessment, with the exception of just a couple things, which I'll talk about here in a minute. This is developed, published, or not published. It's a website that's managed by UC Davis, and really handy, just easy. You can kind of zoom around almost like Google Earth and look at soils, and yeah, really handy resource. Okay, the next resource that I think is important to have is some level of topographic knowledge, and that almost, that goes without saying, but having an understanding of where dividing lines are between watersheds on your farm, and topographic maps. You can get those. You can look at those through some state websites as well. We have one in Vermont called the Natural Resources Atlas. But those topographic maps are really helpful for understanding the size of the watershed and delineating the edge of the watershed where it's not quite clear. Does water flow over here, or does water flow that way? And sometimes those uncertainties can have pretty big implications for the size of the watershed and the amount of water that could be potentially generated within that watershed. So having some topographic knowledge, and preferably some topographic maps are helpful, unless it's a really clear-cut, hilly landscape where you know exactly where that watershed is because there's the hilltop. Those are pretty clear-cut. Okay. Observations, of course, and you can use your own observations if you've been on that land, familiar with that land for a number of years, or prior landowners and neighbors' observations. If you're new to this land, asking, do we usually see ponding here? Does this stream usually flow during dry periods of the year? All those kind of questions that people with historical knowledge of the land might be able to answer. Oh, and of course, my favorite one, a shovel. Get out there, have a shovel, go out there, dig in the soil, understand the soil texture, understand where you have thin soils, understand where you have deep soils. You can understand, where those sandy pockets are, where potentially where the ledge is, soil, and just that firsthand knowledge is very helpful. Oh, and then I guess I skipped one here. Technical assistance as well. This is, I mentioned this before, but just having someone, whether it's NRCS, Conservation District Extension, folks, and in some cases a private consultant. These folks who do this a lot can bring a lot, can bring new perspectives and a lot of knowledge to this kind of endeavor of managing water at the farm scale. Okay, so here is, just wanted to show a snapshot of the soil survey for those who haven't seen this. And you can kind of see this is actually a piece of land I live on up in South Starksville, Vermont. And you see this different soil types are mapped. One word of caution, soil survey is a good guide. It's a good first guess at what specific soils are located the way they're mapped. It's not always exactly that way when you go on the ground and start to investigate within a field, but some pretty good handy guidance just to start with. And then what I've also put here are what I think are the key information that's given within the soil survey that is useful, that we can use as we go about assessing whole farm water management. So for starters, soil texture, my favorite, they give a pretty good breakdown of soil texture, and that's one place where they are fairly accurate, I think, for the different soil series of quantifying the soil texture. Available water capacity. This is an indication of how much water within the soil profile is available to plants, and I don't think it means a lot, except in a relative sense. So if you compare a sandy soil to a clay soil, or a loamy soil to a sandy soil at different fields across the farm, you start to understand which ones will maintain crops or crops better because of their ability to hold water and provide that water for crops. Hydrologic soil group. I'll have another slide on this in just a moment. This is this is the best indication of how likely that soil is, that field is to produce runoff, which of course has meaning for lots of all of the things we want to do around whole farm water management. Drainage class, knowing whether a field is very poorly drained or very well drained or somewhere in between that. Very, very useful information. Does a field flood frequently? Is a field apt to have ponded water in it? What's the depth to the water table? What's the depth to bedrock? What's the depth to a restrictive layer? And restrictive layer being not just bedrock, but those layers I mentioned earlier and that we see in glaciated landscapes that might stop movement of water down through the soil. So those are very well mapped within the soil survey. So really helpful information there. And then what I'd really like about the web soil survey versus that UC Davis soil web is they provide some of these little bonus kind of recommend or ratings, like suitability for ponds. They rate how appropriate is soil for a reservoir pond. So essentially, how well would it hold water, or would it be too leaky for a pond? How appropriate are the soils in a particular field to build embankments? So what is their engineering appropriateness for that? Excuse me. Is a particular soil or location appropriate for an excavated pond? So not building up a dam to capture water in a watershed, but really excavated and a pond that's fed by groundwater. And then of course these are good rules of thumb, I think, good recommendation guideposts. But again, consulting with an engineer is always recommended when we start to get into that level of consideration around what we're going to do with whole farm water management. All right, so those are some kind of like, I think, starting points, kind of trying to lay the foundation for whole farm water management. And then what I want to do now is kind of look at the two most common questions that I hear from farmers when it comes to whole farm water management. And so to me, it's like really where the rubber meets the road on this stuff. One is, do I have a suitable pond site? And, all the follow-on questions that go with that. How big should that pond be? How expensive is that pond going to be? How big can the dam be, et cetera, et cetera. But kind of the starting point of, do I have a suitable pond site, is where all that kind of springs from, I think. And then the second question is, how do I remove excess water? And that's really about drainage. And so, but it can be approached a few different ways. But this is really kind of that question that is very, very common in a wet environment like New England, where I have wet areas. I'm trying to address these. What's the best way to do that? And so we'll start with this pond question, and then we'll move on to the drainage question. Okay, so to start, soil texture. I said that this is kind of paramount when evaluating a field or a soil. And just I think we're all aware of this, that soil texture has a tremendous effect on infiltration rates, right? I mean, water soaks in quicker into a sand than it does in a loam, than it does into a clay. And that in itself is nice to know, but really why that matters is because the less water that infiltrates, the more water that runs off, right? And that's what the water that runs off is probably the water that's causing problems, or that's the water we have potential to capture for our pond if we're thinking about building a pond. And so hydrologic soil group is a good indication of that, and this can be found in the web soil survey. There's 4 different categories from A to D. A being your coarser textured soils, and then D being your heavier soils, your clay soils, and sometimes other factors other than soil texture. I've significantly shortened the definitions for these hydrologic soil group categories, because they can also be influenced by bedrock, by ledge, et cetera, et cetera. It's really nice that those kind of all of those considerations are combined into this one simple rating. So with it's a little bit of a blunt instrument, but it's, again, like I said, it's a good guidepost for understanding how likely a particular field is for generating runoff. And then it's not just about these inherent soil characteristics, right? When we're thinking about how much water infiltrates and ultimately how much water runs off, management also has a huge influence on that. And this is I really like this. This is an older figure. You think we're just, we're in the era of soil health, and this initial work here was done in 1950. It just blows my mind that it kind of we're still like we're still producing this type of information, and it hasn't really stuck yet. But it's really kind of enlightening to see that this long ago we were doing this type of work and seeing how management was influencing infiltration rates and runoff rates. And you can kind of see the spectrum of from old permanent pasture, really perennial hay ground, down to bare ground crusted, and the huge difference in infiltration that you see, and the huge difference in runoff, right? So even if we have a certain soil texture, a certain hydrologic soil group, if that land, that field is managed a different way, within this spectrum, will produce different amounts of runoff from that. So just good to be aware of that that guidepost, again, it's a guidepost, but it can be very different based on management. Oh, and I've put this slide in here. I use this slide a lot when I talk about soil and runoff. This is a rainfall simulator, and I just think it does a really good job of showing how land use influences amounts of runoff. So I have 5 slices of soil from the same farm, and then they're treated differently. I have a kind of a conventional till, soil there on the left. The next one in is the same soil, side not 2 feet apart, with some mulch on it. Then I have a poorly managed pasture, a well-managed pasture, and then a perennial hay field, kind of permanent hay. And you can see the buckets in the front capture the water that runs off of those soils when we rain on them, and then the buckets in the back capture the water that soaks into those soils. And you can kind of see that gradient. It's so obvious what happens at a landscape scale. Is kind of, we were able to zoom in on that here and see the differences. What a difference land management makes, and this is the type of demonstration you can just talk about for a long time if you want to, because there's so much going on here. But I just want to show this difference in runoff amounts. Okay, so we're talking about ponds here. So my recommendation is, when we think about whole farm water management, we're considering a pond. There are some pretty good resources out there. This is this USDA publication here on the right. It's a good kind of primer on what the process is for planning and designing and constructing a pond. I don't think this is necessarily a handbook by which a landowner could go out and build a pond, but it's really helpful for understanding all the different considerations and all the design that goes into constructing a pond. And some of those questions I have listed there on the left. I'll start with, if you for pond construction, especially if it's building a dam where there's any risk involved of if that dam breaks, definitely want to work with someone qualified. But then some of the other questions: what is the watershed area? We talked about that, kind of using topographic maps to delineate the watershed. Can the pond be done cost effectively? We can build ponds in a lot of locations, but is it going to be cost effective? That's, and there's a wide, range of costs for ponds, given various site conditions. Are on-site soils appropriate for the application? And that has big implications for the cost. So just a few questions that you can kind of start to chip away at with a resource like this. And then this last question, excuse me, what size should it be? I've gone through an example calculation. Just I thought this would be fairly interesting to look at pond construction on a farm in central Maine, and trying to determine if we build a pond of a certain size, how much water do we have to use in the typical summer for irrigation. So this would be a pond that has the primary objective of this pond would be to provide water for irrigation. And that's not every pond's not like this, but that kind of simplified this particular example. Okay, so to walk through that, I assumed we're on a farm where we have 50 acres that are draining to a location, a point in the landscape. This was in central Maine, and that that's important because that relates to the typical amount of precipitation central Maine receives and evapotranspiration, et cetera. Said we have an average climate year. We wanted to build a 2-acre pond. We assumed that we would have 2 inches of seepage. The soils where we could use our on-site soils, and we were going to have 2 inches of seepage out of the bottom of the pond into the surrounding soils per month. So we're not losing that much water. It's a pretty tight pond, but we're losing about 2 inches of depth in the pond. And then even when we've withdrawn all the water that we're going to use for irrigation, we want to stop at a 20% pond volume amount. So we don't want to drain this pond completely dry. We always want to leave about 20% in the pond. And that's for a couple of reasons. For habitat would be one, if there's any aquatic critters in there, and then also to potentially help keep the bottom of the pond from cracking and drying out and cracking, and then it takes time to seal back up once it gets wet again. And I said we're going to look at the time period of June through September. So the first thing we need to do was use that drainage area to calculate the amount of water that would run off into that pond. And this is a handy dandy figure that essentially gives us a good rule of thumb for how many acres of watershed we need per acre feet of water. And if you haven't used acre feet of water before, that's just a volume unit of water. It just means 1 foot of water over an entire acre, and it's that much water. So which is a lot of water, right? But this is saying if we have a pond in central Maine, we need about 2.5 acres per acre foot of water. And this is an NRCS figure from that handbook I provided. Okay. So then we go through a water budget, and we say, we do some calculations. We produce 20 acre feet of water. From that 50 acres, we have 2.7 acre feet of water on the pond itself. We evaporate 3.6 acre feet of water. We lose 1.3 acre feet of water to seepage. And then we want to maintain 4 acre feet of water in the bottom of that pond when we're done irrigating in the summer. So after all this, we kind of go through the addition subtraction here. That gives us 13.8 acre feet available for consumptive use, well, and this doesn't have to be irrigation. Of course, this could be for livestock watering. Whatever it is you need to use water for, this would be the approach that you would use, kind of this water balance approach, to determine whether your pond is going to be sized large enough to meet the need of your demand, whatever your demand is, irrigation or livestock or whatever. And so there's lots of, of course, this is a kind of a back of the envelope calculation. We have many factors that affect consumptive use, climate change for one, wet years, dry years, et cetera. Lots of watershed management characteristics. That map of the US where I had central Maine circled, that doesn't account for those management factors, whether it's hay or whether it's, tilled soil. So those need to be considered. Doesn't account for excessive seepage because of bedrock, you know, because of fractured bedrock or something like that. And it doesn't account for what many people also want to build a pond for is for that for the recreation value, for the habitat value, et cetera, et cetera. But just kind of gives you an idea of how that process goes for determining the size of a pond. Okay. And now we have the next question here we had was, in addition to a suitable pond site, the other question was, I'm sorry, I was just looking at my time, make sure I'm a little bit over, but I think I can finish up here quick, is how do I remove excess water? So this is really about drainage. And lots of questions follow on after that. If you have a location on the farm where you have excess water, you're trying to deal with that, you have to ask yourself a few questions, starting with, does the water that you find on that site originate on site? And by on site, I mean primarily precipitation falling on that site and it's not leaving that site. It can't soak in, it can't run off to somewhere else. That would be on-site water. Or is that water coming from off-site? Is it coming from an adjacent field, an adjacent land parcel somewhere? And that has big implications for how we're going to manage, intervene into drainage of that particular piece of land. Is it surface water or groundwater? And then your common types of interventions, three most common would be diversions, berms, et cetera, things for surface water. Ditches can be built to handle surface water and subsurface water. There are different types of ditches. And then artificial drainage, which is what we call tile drainage. And some of you may be familiar with that. I just have a schematic of that. I do a lot of talks on drainage, and tile drainage used to be actually made with terracotta tile. There's a picture of an old you know, horseshoe shaped tile there, but now it's that corrugated black perforated pipe that you see around foundation drains, et cetera, et cetera. And this has been used for you know, over a century in the United States, starting with that terracotta type, and now it's this plastic type. It's, you know, it's used on large farms in pattern type designs, but I wanted to focus on this here. Kind of, if you look at my different patterns on the left hand side of the screen, the bottom right one is the random design. So for smaller farms, especially in hilly topography, this is very common and can be very effective, where you just have individual tile lines or just a couple branches on a tile line that extend into a depressional area within a field and can really work wonders in terms of drying out that really wet area in a field that always, you know, causes issues with pugging with livestock or with, you know, tractor traffic. So the tile is not just for big farms. It's been used successfully on small farms for much longer than it has in a pattern design on large farms, I would say. And then, you know, when you go to install something like tile, or any type of drainage intervention, I'll always come back to the soil. It's really important to know your soils. Here's a picture of one of those fragipan soils that I mentioned earlier. See these a lot in Vermont: Cabot soils, Peru soils. There's many others that have this, and it's just this densic layer at about 30 inches. And that stops vertical water movement. So if you go in to put tile into a soil that has this, if you put that into that densic layer, it'll seal right back up and the tile won't function. Just kind of giving examples of things that's good to know and good to understand the soil before you intervene. And this has big implications for how you would address hill slope drainage as well. I have dug into these soils where it's been really nice and dry on the surface, and dug down to that 30-inch level at the toe of a slope, and you can literally just see water coming off of that densic layer, just like a stream of water flowing over that, because underground. And so any type of surface berm would not work for that type of situation. We need to use something that goes to the depth of that density layer, that flow path. And I think my last slide here, and this is just kind of putting what I just said, giving some graphics to what I just said. So there's, berms on the hillside that are great. If you look at the top left, great for surface flows. But then if we have some of that subsurface flow, you look just below that, we'd want to intervene with some sort of subsurface drainage ditch or tile at the toe of that slope to capture that subsurface water movement. And there's another example of that on the right with a permeable backfill, with a gravel backfill at the toe of a slope. And that gravel backfill is really nice because you're not only then able to capture subsurface flow, but then if there is any surface flow and you have that gravel ditch right to the top of the surface of the soil, that surface water can then go right into that gravel trench and right into your tile line and be carried away. So this is, I swear this is my last slide. So this is the drain tile museum in Geneva, near Geneva, New York. So if you're ever interested in a thrilling summer vacation in the Finger Lakes of New York, this is a must visit destination where you can see all kinds of, where the first tile in America was installed by this guy, John Johnson, who immigrated to the US from Scotland and increased grain yields from like 10 bushels an acre to 100 bushels an acre with tile. So for those of you geeks on drainage, this is a great place to visit.